Actually, mau kata baru mau berhenti. Belum ada belum.
Hello everyone, let's start the session. So last session we discussed about creating an Angular project, configuring the Angular project, how do we start and run the Angular project. Have you practiced that? Have you practiced that part? Have you tried creating Angular application and designing the Angular application? Were you able to successfully run that Angular application? Have you tried this? Yeah, good, good. Is everything working fine? Is everything working fine for you? Yeah, good. Right. So now we learned how to create an Angular application. Now how we can start with it, how to design, how do we configure. So we will see one by one. So few important things here. Actually, in Angular, so now we are going to learn how to deal with the components. How do we deal with the components? So first topic we need to understand in Angular is how to design the components. Yeah. Yesterday we learned the basic architecture, how actually Angular works. Now we need to first understand about components. So components in Angular. We need to learn the components. Now working with the components is important here. Once you know this, then you can design applications. So actually, what is a component and how these components are configured, right? Already I told you that Angular is used for designing single page application. Angular is used for designing single page applications, SPA. So it is single page application, the application. So Angular application starts with index.html. So so index.html, and every component is accessed and used on index.html. That means user will stay on one page and gets access to everything. User will stay on one page. That means user will not navigate from one page to another page. User will not navigate from one page to another page. User will stay on one page and he gets access to everything onto that page. So technically, components are building blocks for Angular application. They are building blocks for Angular application. Angular application is built with it. For example, just I will show you a simple point. Actually, means a simple diagrammatic form. Here I will show you to understand. Actually, we have Angular application. And generally, so here, when you are dealing with an Angular application, when you are configuring an Angular application, so the Angular application starts with index.html, and on this you have so the options. So for example, so you have a login, and you have an option like register. So login and register. You have options like login and register. Actually, we generally have a separate login component. This login component comprises of logic. This login component comprises of HTML, that means markup, design, And this component comprises of some effects. That means it comprises of styles. A component usually comprises of UI, styles, and the logic. And this component is accessed. This component is accessed. The same you will have in suppose another component called register. The same you will have on another component called register component. The same you will have on another component called register. So register, another component called register. Now important is when user clicks on login, then automatically this component will be rendered here. That component will be rendered here. That means its logic, its functionality, everything will happen here. So similarly, when I click register, then register component will go there. So that means user will stay on only one page and he will get access to everything on that page. Generally in our HTML, what happens? I click on login, then you will be redirected. You will be redirected from index page to login page. But here redirection will not happen. So here it will automatically bring that and display here. So entire Angular application is built with components. So actually every component, so it is built with components. So technically you can say typically component is like a template, with presentation, logic and styles. Just like you have learned Bootstrap components, here Angular components are same. Bootstrap component means, if you remember, we learned model, we learned carousel, we learned alerts, we learned navigation bars. Actually, what are those in Bootstrap? In Bootstrap, we call them as components. Why? Because these components are responsible for providing a template which you can implement in your page without writing much logic. So typically component comprises of presentation, logic and styles. Actually presentation is designed in HTML. Presentation is designed in HTML. Presentation is designed in HTML. Logic is defined in TS, TypeScript. It is defined in TypeScript. Logic is defined in TypeScript. And the styles are defined in dots in CSS. Styles are defined in CSS. So that means every component contains a presentation, logic and styles. Actually, so we can design components in two ways. How to design component? So here I will give you a point: component design techniques. There are two techniques for designing component. One technique is inline documentation technique. Inline documentation technique. Another one is code behind technique. What is difference between inline documentation technique? The difference is nothing but In inline documentation technique, in this technique, presentation, logic, and the styles are defined. All are defined in one file. All are defined in one file. All are defined in one file. That is inline documentation technique. That means presentation is defined there, logic is also defined there, and styles are also defined. Everything is defined in one file. Everything is defined in one file. So, and usually the file will have the extension .ts. So everything is designed in one file, and the file will have extension ts. So, but code behind technique, in this technique, we have to maintain. So maintain separate files. We have to maintain separate files. Generally, presentation is maintained. Presentation is defined in .html, and logic is defined in .ts, and styles are defined in .css. That means every component will have three files. What is difference? Which one is best? It depends on situation. Which one is best you can decide according to situation. Because sometimes what we want is, we want a standard functionality. We don't want regular extensions. We want a simple standard functionality. We don't want regular extensions. That means regular changes. So in that case, you can go with inline documentation technique. Inline documentation technique, if everything is present in one file, with one request, everything will load. But problem is, if all are present at one place, separation issues will come. Testing issues will come, extension issues will come. So, but if you don't require any extensions, then you can better go with this kind of inline approach, because it will be little bit faster. So because everything is present in one file. But if you are designing in three files, what is good is clean separation, design separate, logic separate, and effects separate. But if number of files are increased, then automatically page load time will increase. When number of files increase, the page load time increase. That is the basic thing. Already we know that if number of files request will increase, page load time will increase. So we need to reduce the number of requests. We need to better reduce the number of requests coming to the page. But this is very good for reusability. This is very good for extensibility. This is very good for testing. It is good everywhere. So that is the reason we need to follow this approach. And handle this approach. So technically, so it depends on the situation, which one you will use, inline or code behind. I will show you both techniques. Let's create a component first. Let's create a component by using this technique. And to create component, the basic, some important rules are present. I will tell you how to design the component and configure the component. So actually, so let's go to our project. In the project, so you have to maintain all the components. You have to maintain all the components in the app folder. That means application related all resources are maintained in app folder. You have to maintain everything inside this app folder. So what I am doing now, go to this app folder and create a separate folder. create a separate folder called components. Components, that is the separate folder. So component separate folder. Now in this we will maintain all our components. We created a separate folder called components. Now in this we will create a simple concept. Inline technique. Inline technique first we will see. Inline technique means everything is present in one file. Everything is present in one file. So how you design? How you design? For that, in the components, we will add a new file. We will add a new file. I will give the name as login.component.ts. Remember, file name can be anything. Extension must be TS. So here, every component must have this suffix name as component. It must have the suffix name as component. So this is important while defining the component. It must have the suffix name component. Actually, it is not a mandatory concept. It is not mandatory concept to have, because that is not extension actually. That is not extension. So if it is not an extension, then it is not mandatory. If it is not an extension, then it is not mandatory. But in the debugger, so as per the rules of Angular, they mention this name for component as required to be component. Otherwise, they show warnings. They say that you are not following the correct rules for designing component. To avoid such warnings, you better give the name component first. And it's a TypeScript extension must be .ts. The extension is defined as .ts. Okay. Now, how to design a component? How do we configure the component? Remember, typically component is a class. Typically component is a class. So we have to create a class called login component. That is the class name. So this is the class name. We created a class login component. But it is not yet having a component behavior. And one more problem is there. You created a class component. One second. So you created a class called component. So component, and it is present in this file login.component.ts. Any file, any class that you created in a separate file, that means any class that you designed in this file is not accessible outside the file. You can access inside the file. If you want to access outside the file, then we have to mark that class as export. Export is a term used to tell that it is accessible outside this file. If a class is not configured as export, then it is not accessible outside. It is not accessible outside the file. So we need to make it export. Okay. Now still it is an ordinary class. It is not having component behavior. How to give component behavior? To give a component behavior, we have to write this is called marker. This marker tells that this class is a component now. Otherwise, it is not component. But important is, so here remember, important is This component marker is present in an input that library. You have to import the library. Import and from is at the Angular library. You have to import a component base class. You have to import a component base class. Once you import the component base class, so once you configure it, but still the component marker is not finished. This component marker so requires attributes to define. This component need to define. So here we need to define the attributes. Are nothing but first you have to tell how this component is accessible in index page. How to access this component in index page. To access this component in index page, you need a selector. You need a selector. And selector tells how it is accessible in the index page. Selector is defined by using app. That means selector indicates how this login component is accessible. The login component is accessible by using app login. It is mandatory that every component selector must start with. It must start with app prefix, and you can give any name. In index page, how we access it, we need to use that selector as like this, app login. We have to write like this, app login, like a tag. You have to access that and use it. Like an element, you need to configure it like this. Then automatically the will come play inside this index page. So the components are accessed in a page in the okay. Next, what HTML it have to render? You have to tell what HTML it have to render. So it should render template. Template indicates what HTML it should render. Here we need to design HTML. We will use backtick and we'll put a heading. We will put a heading and close the heading. And we will say, so this is login component. So that means login component, or simply I will create a data list. So data list close. Okay. So data list close, and here we designed, backtick, you can design all data type. Input type is equal to text, and data definition close, and data term is price, and data term and data definition is password. We will give a right, and password, the type is a password. Okay, just we designed some concept here that we just have a button and say login and close the button. Fine. This is what the HTML we want. This is what the HTML we want. This is the presentation. It is the presentation. We configured the presentation and we defined the presentation. Now this is the presentation we need to define for that, right? So the component is already there. So you don't need times one is enough. So component is already configured. Okay. This is how we need to specify the content. That means how to access the component, and when you access, what it render. Heading is empty. Heading is empty. You know already JavaScript HTML combination. Suppose this is the logic. Here we created a property called title. title is equal to user login. Title is equal to user login. Configure that user login. Title is equal to user login. And this title I want to render in this heading location. I want to render in that heading location. So usually when it comes into the user location, right, when it is coming into user location, right, we need to define here when it is coming into user location here generally is it clear now? Is it any problem in the voice again? Is there any audio issue? Is there any audio issue? Now it is okay. In between maybe Kanana, right? Now it is fine. Well, clearly now, or is it okay now? Problem? Let me check one second. Still it is having an issue, voice breaking, anything? Okay then. Actually, we started offline sessions here in Hyderabad, right? And that's the reason we need to take the session from our institute. Some connection issue may be there, right? I will resolve that, and mostly tomorrow onwards there will be no problem in this. Okay, na? All right. Is it clear? Anything now? Audio a little bit. Fine. Is it clear now? Right. Good. Okay. People.
দরকার আছে পানি পড়ে তারপরে
Okay.
তোর ভাই তো খাও না
Is it clear or is it any problem still exists? Check this now. The component base. So we are importing the component base. After importing the component base, every component needs selector. Selector indicates how component template. So here, what presentation? Now, presentation, you have to design all your HTML that you want to present using a back design. Why? Because you can put expression. For example, title is having user login. This title I want to render here. Binding expression is dollar flower brace. The binding expression is double curly braces. This is angular binding expression. So we have to use this angular binding expression. We have to use this angular binding expression. And here, so we need to do that. We need to define that type. Something about the audio. Let's do one thing. Let's break the session here. I will do one thing. Will not be an issue because here we have a connection issue little bit. Continue, and we will have a session on Sunday. Okay, now I will tell you the time tomorrow, so that Sunday we can spend more time and to cover all break. Okay, continue tomorrow then. Okay.